Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're embarking with you on an in-depth exploration of Jacinda Ardern's new memoir, A Different Kind of Power. It just came out June 3rd, 2025.
That's right.
And our mission really is to take you behind the curtain a bit. Look at her public life, her private life, and try to distill the key insights, her leadership style, the challenges, the bigger picture. We've gone through the book, looked at the early reactions, and we want to bring you the core takeaways. Hopefully, you'll get some surprising facts and a deeper feel for what made her leadership so, well, distinctive.
It really is a compelling narrative. It makes a strong case for what she terms empathetic courage.
Empathetic courage. I like that.
Yeah. And we'll be looking at how she balanced that, the heartfelt side with practical policy.
Yeah.
And what her story tells us about that whole mix of power, parenthood, and politics. It's quite the intersection.
Okay, so let's unpack this different kind of power. Where did it begin? The memoir takes us right back, doesn't it, to her childhood in Murupar, daughter of a police officer, seeing gang markings around. How did those early moments shape her sense of justice, do you think?
Well, it seems they were pretty fundamental. Those experiences growing up in a place with real challenges and then later moving away from the Mormon church in her 20s.
Right, but she kept the service aspect, she said.
Exactly. She kept those lessons of community and service. And all of that together really shaped her perspective on leadership. It wasn't abstract for her. It feels like a very grounded origin story.
And then from there, Morrinsville College, a history teacher, the debating team, fueling her voice. And there's this really interesting anecdote, isn't there? Crying at 13, listening to Peace Train.
Yeah, that one stood out.
And then fast forward 30 years, post-Christchurch, and Yusuf Islam performs it, and she cries again. What does that tell us? That connection.
It's incredibly revealing, I think. It shows this consistent thread of deep empathy, a real connection to human feeling, to peace. It suggests her emotional responses weren't just for show later on. They were rooted deep down from way back.
So these experiences kind of build, and then naturally, politics. She starts out interning for Helen Clark in the Beehive.
Right, the Beehive.
What was the big takeaway from that early experience?
Well, she says the crucial lesson was, and this is a quote, "You could be sensitive and survive." That was huge for her.
Turning a perceived weakness into a strength.
Exactly. And it's funny, she also mentions Helen Clark mishearing her name in a meeting early on.
Oh, really?
Yeah, small thing, but it kind of highlights that early invisibility, compared to where she ended up. Quite the contrast.
So, elected MP in 2008, then years in opposition, learning the ropes, constituency work.
Right, the parliamentary dynamics.
But she also talks very openly about self-doubt, actually saying, I wasn't meant for this.
That's quite candid.
Yet she becomes deputy leader, then suddenly leader, just 7 weeks before the 2017 election. Because others step aside, it wasn't this grand plan.
No, it really wasn't. And that raises interesting questions, doesn't it? About how people actually end up in positions of power. It's not always the obvious path or the most ambitious person.
Definitely challenges that narrative.
Yeah, sometimes it's people who are maybe a bit hesitant, but they step up when needed. A different kind of strength, perhaps.
And speaking of unexpected moments, that scene during the coalition talks, things hanging in the balance.
Oh, the pregnancy test anecdote.
Yes. Waiting in a friend's bathroom while these huge political deals are being hammered out. What does that moment capture?
It's just, it's groundbreaking, isn't it? It highlights the sheer uniqueness of her situation. She's about to become prime minister and she's pregnant.
Effaced in modern politics.
Right. And it immediately blurred those lines between her private life and her public role, right from the very start. It shaped everything that came after, in a way.
Okay, so from those personal moments, the book moves into probably the most defining crisis of her premiership. The Christchurch mosque attack in 2019.
A terrible, terrible event.
Her response was so immediate, empathy-driven, wearing the hijab, the phrase, "they are us."
Incredibly powerful.
And pushing through new gun laws in just 10 days.
Yeah, 10 days, astonishing speed.
The book unpacks this empathetic courage. But what's the actionable insight there? For any leader, it's more than just feeling sorry, right?
Absolutely. What the book suggests is that her raw emotional presence, her willingness to share in the grief, wasn't separate from policy. It was a policy lever.
How so?
Well, think about her saying, "I am so, so sorry" to Imam Fuda. That built immediate trust. It created solidarity. And that, in turn, created the political space for rapid action on things like gun laws,
Right.
because it resonated so deeply. It was emotional intelligence as a tool of governance.
That makes sense. Then the book shifts to the pandemic, the whole zero COVID strategy.
Right, a very different kind of crisis.
Based on public health data, early lockdowns, sealed borders, contact tracing, and the results, initially at least, were striking. Very low death rates, only 25 in that first year.
Quite remarkable compared to many other places.
But what's fascinating is how the memoir weaves this massive state-level planning with the intense reality of parenting a young child.
Yeah, that's where the different kind of power title really comes alive, I think.
Zoom calls with Neve, breastfeeding, baking birthday cakes, sleep deprivation.
All while making decisions about border closures, supply chains,
Yeah.
things affecting the entire nation. It just highlights this constant juggle, this blurring of the public and private that few leaders ever expose so openly.
And she shares some very specific, relatable moments. The cake baking attempts,
Yes. The slightly dodgy-looking birthday cake.
tracking Neve's first words, data, then mama, pumping milk at work. It really hits home, that double shift.
It really does. You wonder how she managed it all.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing, and the book touches on this too. The criticism, being called a show pony, questions about her substance.
Right. That definitely came through. The backlash was real. And she explains how she tried to use humor, deflection sometimes to kind of steer away from the cultural war attacks.
Do you think that strategy always worked? Or did it sometimes look like avoidance?
That's a fair question. The book frames it more as a way to protect her focus, to not get bogged down in unproductive fights.
Okay. So, taking all this, the personal stories, the public scrutiny, the strategies, what does the book say this means for female leadership specifically?
Well, she talks about walking a tightrope, wanting to advance feminist principles, but not wanting to be defined only by her gender.
Mm-hmm.
So pushing back when it was really necessary, like on inappropriate questions about maternity leave, but maybe not engaging every single slight. It sounds like a conscious choice to conserve energy and lead on her own terms, not get boxed in.
Then the book gets quite personal towards the end of her tenure. Late 2022, the breast lump scare.
Yeah. That was a sobering moment described in the book.
Forcing her to really confront her own mortality, asking what if it's cancer, and how that led her to rethink her capacity to keep going.
It really underscores the immense personal toll. Leadership at that level, combined with the public scrutiny, motherhood, it's not just about policy wins and losses. It's about your actual physical and mental reserves.
Ignoring those signals has consequences.
Absolutely. For the person, and maybe for their ability to lead effectively, too. The book subtly makes that point.
And that soul-searching led to a conversation with Neve, her daughter.
Right, the part where Neve says we should never give up.
Yeah, and that contrasts so sharply with Ardern's own feeling at that point, her sense that she just didn't have enough left.
A very poignant moment. And that conversation, according to the memoir, was a key factor leading to her resignation in January 2023.
Famously saying her tank was empty.
Which is such an unusually honest thing for a world leader to say. It acknowledges limits in a way we rarely see.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive here, let's pull out the core themes. Her mantra seems crystal clear throughout. Kindness has a power and strength almost nothing else has.
Definitely. That's central. And what's clear is how she sees that empathy balanced with practical policy. It's not either.
Right, data-driven action, but also emotional intelligence.
Exactly. The book argues they're intertwined. An empathetic response can actually enable faster policy action. One of the key takeaways listed is precisely that. Empathy is a strategic asset, not some kind of weakness.
And the book definitely offers a powerful female leadership lens, doesn't it? Showing statecraft alongside baking cakes and dealing with self-doubt. It challenges those old, very male-coded ideas of leadership.
It really does. It presents a counter-narrative, showing that vulnerability or having a visible domestic life doesn't have to diminish your authority. In fact, she suggests integrating it can make leadership more relatable, more human, especially perhaps for other women.
Though we do need to acknowledge what the book doesn't delve into deeply, its honest limitations.
Yes, that's important.
It does tend to gloss over some of the more controversial domestic policy areas, housing, poverty, inflation. Doesn't get deep into caucus politics or election strategy either. Why do you think that choice was made?
Well, it's speculative, but the book focuses heavily on her personal journey and those big crisis moments, Christchurch, the pandemic, which were, in many ways, unifying. By maybe sidestepping the more divisive policy debates, The narrative stays focused on that unifying empathetic image. It makes it a stronger leadership manifesto, perhaps, but maybe a less complete political record. An editorial choice, really.
Which leads perfectly into the reception. The global relevance and backlash, huge praise internationally, Oprah-level stuff, seen as this manifesto for empathy and leadership.
Absolutely. Those 10 takeaways on empathetic governance are getting a lot of attention globally.
Yet back home in New Zealand, some reviewers are pointing out that lack of depth on domestic issues,
Mhm.
the fallout from border rules, inflation, poverty, the complexities of co-governance reforms.
Right, those agreements between the government and Maori groups. There's definitely a sense among some New Zealand commentators that the book doesn't fully grapple with the tougher, less globally celebrated aspects of her time in office.
So a fascinating disconnect there between the global icon and the domestic realities.
It is. And it's a tension the memoir doesn't fully resolve.
So summing up, it's an earnest book, emotionally rich, definitely inspiring if you're drawn to compassionate leadership.
For sure.
But if you're looking for a deep dive into policy specifics or political strategy,
Hmm.
well, you might find it wanting. It's more personal account than policy blueprint.
Definitely. So as you reflect on this deep dive into a different kind of power, it's worth thinking about how Ardern's blend of empathy, data, and vulnerability challenges, or maybe reaffirms your own ideas about what makes a leader effective today, especially in our complex world.
Yeah, what really stands out to you about her approach, and how might her experience shape how we see leadership going forward? Is this different kind of power a sign of a real shift, do you think, or was it something unique to her and her circumstances? Lots to think about.